the the perils of technology and having records of conversations while you're at it. Okay, to you, Sanjukta.
Yeah. Hi everyone, I am Sanjukta. On the behalf of the entire Dark team, I would like to welcome all of you to another Dark BAITHAK and the first session of our Dark BAITHAK Ambedkar series. The Dark began in 2023 as a book review journal, publishing original reviews across disciplines and genres. From the start, we sought to reimagine the form of book reviews itself. However, over time, we have grown into a biannual academic journal where we are publishing now reviews, commentaries, weeklies, and research essays also, which is built around different themes. Each issue is built around a central theme, and our double blind peer review process ensures rigor, while our editorial approach values accessibility and creative thought. The Dark Bathak is our humble attempt to bring people around a small gathering of scholars, writers, students from different fields to present ideas and initiate a dialogue, bringing critical conversations to life. With today's session, I would like to announce the beginning of our Ambedkar series, where we are trying to build a sustained engagement with the philosophy, politics, and personhood of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar through sustained conversations with contemporary writers and scholars. For our first session, we have Ankit Kawade discussing his book, The Ambedkar-Nietzsche Provocations, The Genius of the Chandala and the Gospel of the Superman. Ankit Kawade is a PhD student at the Department of Political Science, Johns Hopkins University. He broadly works in the field of comparative political theory and is mainly interested in modern Indian, European, and American political thought. He completed his MA and MPhil from the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and also he is also a graduate associate at the Association for Global Political Thought, Harvard University. With this, I would now welcome Ankit Kawade to start the discussion on his book.
And before we do that, I'm so sorry. I'm going to congratulate Ankit. This is his first book. I know it's been in the making and the working for a very long time. And it's a virtual. He agreed to give his time to us while he's busy. I know for a fact that he's invited at NLS Bangalore as well. And I'm sure he's going to be going to other universities. So I'm sorry I'm announcing these things without asking you, but he still chose this particular, platform of ours where we're really trying to push the envelope for young researchers. So I'm going to use this opportunity to show the book to everybody. It is available on Navayana. He's not asked me to do that. I'm sure he's very embarrassed. And by the end of it, he's going to be like, why did you do that? But here it is. It's a great book. And I would invite everybody to take some time to read it. And now, Ankit, to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jigyasa, and thank you so much, Sanjukta, for introducing me as well. I really support this whole platform and I wish it all the success. So let me start by saying that this book comes out from my MPhil dissertation. Jigyasa showed you the book. I'll just show you my MPhil dissertation as well. I don't know if you can see, but the subtitle of the book comes from the title of my MPhil. I guess you can download it from the JNU library website as well. Anyway, so this MPhil was submitted at the Center for Political Studies, JNU, in 2021 in the midst of the COVID pandemic. Since then, I have extensively revised and expanded the dissertation in the process of working on the book. But the core idea and three-part structure is something that is retained from the MPhil itself. The three-part structure being Nietzsche's reading of the Manusmriti, Ambedkar's reading of the Manusmriti, and Ambedkar's reading of Nietzsche. So I begin with this, especially because the MPhil program no longer exists in our educational institutions, which makes me feel very old, I guess. But more importantly, the MPhil represented a space and time of experimentation and trial and error for a lot of us before we waded into the more serious world of doctoral research. And it makes me really sad that that space and time of experimentation no longer exists for research scholars in India. All right, moving on. So instead of merely summarizing the book, what I thought I should do in the time allotted to me is to speak about the main interventions of this book concerning two important themes: the historical context in which Nietzsche and Ambedkar encountered the Manusmriti, as well as the method of comparative political theory or comparative philosophy, which is the framework I employ to study that historical context. I will conclude by offering a brief snippet from the book, just to give you a flavor of what kind of analysis is presented therein. So I'll start sharing my screen now. Just a sec. Okay. Okay, I hope you can see this.
Yes, yes, yes.
All right, how do I, just a sec. Oops.
Animate. I think we
The
will need to
play, I
animate.
think, or the play one, play button there.
Yeah, just a second.
And Ankit, you're now so
Oh yeah,
widely.
I can see it. Can you
Yeah.
see my presentation going live?
Yes.
Okay, cool, cool. I'll start from here. All right. So, okay. So one usual response that one tends to get when one mentions the Manusmriti is that it is only owing to British colonialism that this text acquired the kind of status that it has today, both for upholders as well as the critics of the tradition of thought exemplified by this ancient scripture. This can be called the functional irrelevance thesis, which basically states that the text was no longer and not as relevant for Indian society as it was made out to be in the 19th and 20th centuries, the time period in which Nietzsche and Ambedkar encounter this text. So, Nicholas Dirks, a historian, writes that whatever its historical status, most scholars today agree that it, that is the Manusmriti, took on unprecedented status as an applied legal document only under British rule. End of quote. Patrick Olivell, a Sanskrit scholar and Indologist, writes that the centrality of Manu to the Dharma tradition is not simply because it was given prominence by Western Orientalists, further mentioning that long before Sir William Jones entered the scene, Manu was the dominant voice on Dharma for close to 2 millennia. End of quote. So I consider this debate over the historical status of this text as instructive for understanding Nietzsche's and Ambedkar's interpretations of the Manusmriti, not only because both thinkers encountered this text in its various translated editions, but also because it highlights another historical marker which has a direct contextual bearing on their interpretations. That historical marker is that of modernity. And this book's attempt is to establish that both Nietzsche and Ambedkar encounter this ancient text in a historical context marked by new experiences of modernity. So, in short, modernity represents the main historical context wherein I situate Nietzsche's and Ambedkar's readings of the Manusmriti. So, one idea that acquired a definite historical force in the modern period is that of equality. And although it is not listed as a separate concept of inquiry in any of the book's chapters, this work is saturated by the conceptual force of this idea as animating both Nietzsche's and Ambedkar's interpretations of this text. This text represents for both an ingenious justification of the ideal of inequality or hierarchy, and their varying interpretations of this text rest on their different evaluations of the ideal of equality. It is not accidental then that the most authoritative text of the Dharmashastra tradition found its appeal among certain thinkers across geographical regions who were at the same time thinking about the value and consequences of the idea of equality in their own time. Donald R. Davis Jr., another Sanskrit scholar, says it is fair to say that Dharmashastra, more than any other Hindu tradition, vigorously and unashamedly defends class and caste divisions at both the theological and social levels. End of quote. Hence, caste as a system of inequality in India forms a major concern for both Nietzsche's and Ambedkar's intellectual engagement with this text. Caste, along with its fourfold antecedent of the Varna system as outlined in the Manusmriti, constitutes a consistent theme of discussion across all the chapters in this book. Additionally, the question about the historical context of Nietzsche's and Ambedkar's interpretations of this text makes us consider three interrelated areas of engagement with this ancient text. The first such contextual area is the engagement of modern German thinkers with the Manusmriti as initiated by its translations, first in English by Sir William Jones in 1794 and later into German by Johann Christian Huttner in 1797. Nietzsche encountered the Manusmriti not in the German, but in a French translation done by a French administrative officer called Louis Jacoliot, who was stationed at certain French controlled areas in India like Pondicherry and Chandannagar in West Bengal for a little more than 2 years. However, the reliability of Jacoliot's translation of the Manusmriti first published in 1876, now stands completely discredited. And no philologist and Indologist today considers this text as having any value as a translation of the Manusmriti. Why Nietzsche's reliance on a severely flawed translation of the Manusmriti nonetheless does not discredit his reading of this text is something that I discuss in detail in the book. Ambedkar, on the other hand, relied on the well known British Indologist and scholar Georg Buller's translation of the Manusmriti. The second contextual area that is important for situating Nietzsche's and Ambedkar's interpretations is that of modern Indian thought. As Nietzsche's reading of the Manusmriti occurred in line with prior philosophical engagement with texts from South Asian antiquity, texts such as the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, Kalidasa's Shakuntala, as well as the Buddhist Dhammapada, in the works of Hegel, Schelling, and Schopenhauer. Similarly, Ambedkar's reading of the Manusmriti is preceded by and contemporaneous with the engagement of such modern Indian thinkers like Phule, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, S.R. Rajwade, A.K. Kumaraswamy on the one hand, and Indologists like Sir William Jones, Max Muller, and P.V. Kane on the other. Oftentimes, certain modern Indian thinkers' interpretation of the Manusmriti explicitly drew on Nietzsche's philosophy for justificatory purposes. Kumaraswamy, a 20th century Sri Lankan philosopher and art historian, for instance, interpreted the Manusmriti in light of Nietzsche's philosophy, writing, "So far from a doctrine of self indulgence, it is a form of asceticism or ardor, what he calls tapas, which Nietzsche would have us impose on ourselves if we are strong enough. This was precisely the view of Manu when he established a severe rule of life for the Brahman and one far easier for the Shudra." End of quote. Thus, that the Manusmriti places the highest number of rules and regulations on the Brahmins, thereby making their life most difficult and demanding, is a very common trope that is reproduced even today in the justifications of Manu's fourfold hierarchy of castes, especially with regards to the privileges given to the Brahmins in this text. This book also deconstructs this trope by focusing not on the number of rules and regulations placed on the body of the Brahmin, but their relative freedom to not follow these rules and yet escape punishment. The Shudras and the Ati Shudras are not given this freedom in the Manusmriti, nor, more importantly, in the Hindu society. The third contextual area that this book takes into consideration is the reception of Nietzsche's writings among modern Indian and South Asian thinkers. Among this set of thinkers, one encounters Bal Gangadhar Tilak, S.R. Rajwade, Aurobindo Ghosh, A.K. Kumaraswamy, and perhaps most famously, Muhammad Iqbal, Allama Iqbal, reading and writing on Nietzsche during the 20th century. Okay, so I'll move on to the comparative method of the book now. The Manusmriti is the most commented upon Dharmashastra text, with 9 existing commentaries written by authors whose estimated range of composition is from the 7th, the earliest known commentator Bharuchi, to the 17th century AD, the last known commentator Manirama. However, what separates Nietzsche and Ambedkar from this vast and rich commentarial tradition is that both of them approach this text as non believers. Against this lineage of textual reception, Nietzsche and Ambedkar form a part of the modern interpreters of the Manusmriti. And the modern interest in the Manusmriti roughly begins after the Sanskrit scripture is first translated into English by Sir William Jones in 1794. Another differentiating factor between the Hindu tradition of commentaries on the Manusmriti and its modern interpreters is that the latter practice what is described by the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur as the hermeneutics of suspicion. Ricoeur distinguishes between what he calls a recollection of meaning as constituting a major stream in the practice of textual interpretation from what he calls the exercise of suspicion, as inaugurated by the writings of Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud in the European philosophical tradition. While revelation, reminiscence, and restoration are the primary modes with which meaning is handled in the hermeneutics of faith, demystification and deciphering constitute the fundamental characteristics of the hermeneutics of suspicion. These two modes fundamentally differentiate a believer from a critic. So I place both Nietzsche and Ambedkar as two of the most consequential practitioners of the hermeneutics of suspicion, who read the Manusmriti not in the manner of a believer who seek by way of interpretation to arrive at what Ricoeur calls a second naivete regarding their religious belief. Rather, these two thinkers read this text of canonical Hinduism from a highly critical disposition, whether it is, in Nietzsche's words, to transvalue the fundamental tenets of Christian morality, or it is, in Ambedkar's words, to exhume the buried violence of the composition of the Manusmriti. This text surfaces in these two thinkers' writings at different historical junctures and for diverging purposes. While Nietzsche looked at this text from a distance, finding in its rigid hierarchies a sign of strength against the turgid egalitarianism of modern Europe, Ambedkar saw this text as outlining the blueprint of an apparatus of hierarchy and domination that he most intimately knew and suffered from in modern India. Even as both thinkers do not participate in the interpretive orientation of a faithful believer, their writings nonetheless yield a highly conflicting interpretation of the Manusmriti, as I discuss in detail in the book. So, moving on, a question that centrally occurs to anyone working with the comparative method in philosophy is the following: what renders two or more thinkers comparable? Comparability in each case has to be demonstrated before the proper work of comparison can begin. It can be usually demonstrated through highlighting a similarity or a contrast between the thinkers under consideration, which makes the study of a particular idea or theory or event in these thinkers valuable. The specific import of the comparative method is then the possibility of new insights, even new truths, that we are likely to gain from studying the thinkers in comparison rather than in isolation. So, to the question, what renders two or more thinkers comparable, our response simply is the thought of the question at hand, because of which these otherwise strange figures become part of what the French philosopher Jacques Derrida called a community of the question. In other words, I focus on such questions which were able to concern the thinkers being compared, in that they were compelled to think of it, even if they were separated across time and space. This community, most importantly, makes the student of the thought of such thinkers an integral part of its question, because what holds in common for the student and the thinkers being studied by her is nothing except the question at hand. Thus, the response to the question of comparability to be given by a student of philosophy is nothing except a demonstration of the common concern which holds in common the thinkers being studied. The question at hand between Nietzsche and Ambedkar, as well as between them and us, is rather simple: how to read the Manusmriti. However, the stakes of this question fundamentally implicate the moral substance of their thought, as well as implicating the kind of practices of reading and interpretation that we would like to use for questions that we find important and significant. Hence, even as the method of this book is comparative, it does not intend to flatten the crucial differences between the philosophies of Nietzsche and Ambedkar. On the contrary, this book augments and builds upon the historical disagreements expressed by Ambedkar in his criticism of Nietzsche. At the same time, this work exists in the interstices of the present moment, and I have attempted to engage both these thinkers towards thinking certain questions which, although they have historical antecedents, are fundamentally questions of our time. To that end, another methodological precept that this book takes as important is what Martin Heidegger calls Mitdenken, or thinking with. This work is not an attempt at thinking about Nietzsche or Ambedkar, but is an attempt of thinking with them. The latter involves separating our questions from their questions and delicately balancing the give and take of ideas that influence this interaction between questions across historical contexts. More importantly, in raising these questions, one affirms the same dignity for oneself as the thinkers one is studying, in being equal participants in thinking. And this dignity is what presents itself as a precious possibility in the attempt at thinking with Nietzsche and Ambedkar. So these are merely methodological pointers or precepts or signposts for me. One of the disadvantages of not relying on any one thinker or tradition of methodological interpretation, oh, sorry, I meant one of the advantages, is that I need not subscribe to additional aspects of their thought systems by relying on one or more concepts that form a part of that system. For example, in relying on the term Mitdenken, or thinking with, from Heidegger, I make no further claim of also subscribing to Heidegger's philosophical project of what he calls fundamental ontology. Similarly, in using the phrase community of the question from Derrida, I do not thereby imply that I also subscribe to Derrida's theory and project of deconstruction wholesale. Finally, I would like to conclude my presentation by reading out an excerpt from the book, which occurs in chapter 5, which is also the half of the subtitle of the book. And apologies if it sounds a little random, but believe me, it makes more sense and is part of the argumentative flow in the book itself. So the section is titled The Gospel of the Superman, which, as you would notice, is part of the subtitle of the book as well. So, in Philosophy of Hinduism, an incomplete draft written sometime in the 1940s, Ambedkar writes about the necessity of evaluating the question of what he calls the religious ideal of Hinduism and whether it satisfies the twin tests he had devised at the beginning of his text, that of individual justice and social utility. He is of the view that such a test of evaluating or judging the philosophy of Hinduism is bound to remain inadequate from the very beginning, since, as compared to other religious ideals, Hinduism falls into what he calls a separate class by itself. Pointing out the insufficiency of the question of whether the philosophy of Hinduism values the individual or the society more, Ambedkar reasons that the terms with which such a question is framed misses the singularly class oriented nature of Hinduism. He writes, the center of the religious ideal in Hinduism is neither individual nor society. It is a class, the class of supermen called Brahmins. End of quote. Earlier, in his invited but undelivered speech titled Annihilation of Caste, he wrote, quote, what the Hindus call religion is really law or at best legalized class ethics, end of quote. This judgment of Hinduism was consistent with his lifelong criticism that the Hindu social order constitutes both a denial of society as well as the individual, whose antisocial and anti-individualist spirit is most ingeniously manifested in its ethics of class divisions, or in what Ambedkar calls the principle of gradation and rank. Such an interpretation, in pointing towards the centrality of class divisions within Hinduism, was significant for at least a couple of reasons. First, it sought to distance the philosophy of Hinduism from interpretations which claimed an affinity with the ideals of individual liberty and or social unity, which may or may not distinguish this religion from other world religions like Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, etc. Second, and more importantly for me in this book, such a departure marked the conceptual influence of Friedrich Nietzsche on exactly what distinguished Hinduism from other world philosophies. So in 1945, Ambedkar observed that scholars of Hinduism often tend to understand the significance of caste and untouchability at the cost of neglecting its underlying principle. He wrote, the language commonly used that Hinduism upholds caste and untouchability perhaps disguises and conceals its genius. He writes further, the real genius of Hinduism is to divide. This is beyond dispute. End of quote. This ingenious quality of the philosophy of Hinduism is then explained with the help of multiple quotations from the Manusmriti, the first of which holds the Brahmins to be the lord of all Varnas. Ambedkar then provides his definitive view of the principle upon which this philosophy rests. He writes, Hinduism is the gospel of the Superman, and it teaches that what is right for the Superman is the only thing which is called morally right and morally good. End of quote. The use of the word Superman was not accidental here. Ambedkar's focus on the principle of division between lordship and bondage in the Hindu social order implied that he would often seek parallels of such a philosophy in world history. He writes, is there any parallel to this philosophy? But it is so obvious. The parallel to this philosophy of Hinduism is to be found in Nietzsche. End of quote. The remarkable or startling nature of this parallel to the philosophy of Hinduism is matched only with the obviating circumstances in which Ambedkar makes this claim. Writing in the 1940s, when the pernicious circumstances of Nazism were still being felt in world history, and on whose imperialist and genocidal politics was cast the shadow of Nietzsche's philosophy, Ambedkar is quick to anticipate the reaction of the Hindus to the substance of his incendiary claim. He writes, the Hindus will be angry at this suggestion. It is quite natural, for the philosophy of Nietzsche stands in great odium. Nietzsche's philosophy had become identified with will to power, violence, denial of spiritual values, Superman and the sacrifice, servility and the debasement of the common man. His philosophy with these high spots had created a certain loathsomeness and horror in the minds of the people of his own generation. This is principally due to the revelation that the philosophy of Nietzsche is capable of producing Nazism. End of quote. It is possible here to claim that Ambedkar is merely utilizing the great odium of Nietzsche's philosophy to bolster or intensify his own criticism of the Manusmriti and the philosophy of Hinduism, which were his prime targets of critique in this book. Indeed, such a suggestion would invoke anger in the minds of the Hindus was already anticipated by Ambedkar, and the thoughtful response accruing from this anger against Ambedkar's suggestion would likely take the form of separating the philosophy of Nietzsche from that of Hinduism in the interest of saving the grace of the latter. Even in such an interpretive response, the great odium of the philosophy of Nietzsche would stand as it is. What could be worse than Nietzsche's philosophy? which, according to Ambedkar's own assessment, was generative of the fascist politics of Nazism. Was the philosophy of Hinduism not at least better than Nietzsche's in not bearing a philosophical affinity to a political movement as horrific and loathsome as that of Nazism? Again, pointing at the understandable and expected response of, quote, astonishment and resentment in the minds of the Hindus, Ambedkar cites from Nietzsche's book The Antichrist to show his Hindu audience Nietzsche's own philosophical debt to the most authoritative text of the Hindu legal tradition. So, this is a quote from Nietzsche in Ambedkar's Philosophy of Hinduism. Nietzsche writes, "When I read the law book of Manu, an incomparably intellectual and superior work, it would be a sin against the spirit even to mention it in the same breath with the Bible. You will guess immediately why. It has a genuine philosophy behind it. In it, not merely an evil smelling Jewish distillation of rabbinism and superstition, it gives something to chew even to the most fastidious psychologist. And not to forget the most important point of all, it is fundamentally different from every kind of Bible. By means of it, the noble classes, the philosophers, and the warriors guard and guide the masses. It is replete with noble values. It is filled with the feeling of perfection, with saying yeah to life, and a triumphant sense of well being in regard to itself and to life. The sun shines upon the whole book." End of quote. Nietzsche's own confession about his love for the Manusmriti is reproduced by Ambedkar as evidence of his philosophical parallels with Manu. That Nietzsche admired the incomparable status of the Manusmriti as compared to the Christian Bible does not merely give Ambedkar a new axe with which to grind the philosophy of Hinduism. Indeed, as the paragraph quoted by Ambedkar indicates, Nietzsche is seemingly utilizing the Manusmriti to intensify his criticism of Christianity, which was the mainstay of his last published work. This bears at least a formal similarity with what Ambedkar was doing in utilizing Nietzsche to further intensify his criticism of Hinduism. So, against such an instrumentalist rendering of Nietzsche's reading of the Manusmriti and Ambedkar's reading of Nietzsche for their respective critical projects, which is content with reporting these thinkers' multiple misreadings and misunderstandings, I deal here with a comparatively different and hopefully more thoughtful task. What do these alleged instrumental misreadings of Nietzsche and Ambedkar nonetheless help us to think? I would encourage you all to read the book itself to find out how I handle this question across all its chapters. I'll end there. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Ankit. Sanjukta?
Yeah. Hi, thank you, Ankit. I think before we start opening the
Just a,
question, yeah.
just a second.
Wait.
Ankit, were you saying something?
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to figure out how I can stop sharing the screen. Okay.
Yeah,
I
it's
figured
been
it out.
figured out. You've stopped
Thank you.
sharing. It was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Sanjukta.
Yeah, I before we open the floor for questions, I would like to welcome Sakshi and Vedal from the team to discuss and carry forward the discussion. Sakshi is a PhD scholar at the Center for Law and Governance at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Vedal has been our anchor for the Ambedkar Reading Group since January. He has been anchoring the whole entire Ambedkar Reading Group since January. So I would like to call Sakshi first. Sakshi Vatwa. I think she's here, right?
Hi, yes,
Yes.
can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you, Sakshi.
Yeah.
It would have been good if we could see you, but then I'm on the side of human as opposed to the technology. So even if we could hear you, that would be enough.
Yeah, I'm afraid you lose me if I switch on the camera.
No, we don't want to lose you. You should go as it is. Okay.
So I'll just briefly share about the book. With the tradition of thinking with in the form of more collective inquiry, the book invites readers to critically engage with a broad scholarship on untouchability. At its core is a comparative approach in which two eminent scholars, Ambedkar and Nietzsche, though torn apart by time and space, engage in an exchange of ideas, particularly about Chandala and more broadly about egalitarianism versus particularity, with Ambedkar favoring the former. The book offers a whistle stop tour from the decontextualized yet creatively transformed interpretations of Chandala by Nietzsche, the historical significance of the term as the outcast from the Varna system, Ambedkar's attempt at the Hindu Code Bill, and the bloodless revolution or anti-foundation. And it ends with the meaning of annihilation, all encapsulated in a simultaneous dialogue on two fronts. First, between Nietzsche and Ambedkar's ideas, and second, between the author and readers trying to navigate both interesting and illuminating ideas of these two scholars who provide newer avenues of understanding and, as the author has suggested, the essence of casteism along with its empirical manifestations. Lastly, the book is not only pedagogical in its emphasis on comparative research methodology and on engaging with scholarly texts with a mindset of critique rather than unquestioning obedience. The contradictions highlighted in the book ranged from fire and water as means of resistance, the revolution of Buddhism and the counter revolution of Brahmanism, revolution with bloodshed and without bloodshed, the new Manu and the modern Manu, the noon of an alpine valley embodying tranquility for Nietzsche, and the scorching noon of Western India during the Peshwa regime, contempt for the untouchable and worshipability of the Brahmins, practice of untouchability by refusing to accept water from an untouchable woman while indulging in sexual exploitation against her. Against this grain, the Hindu society is then projected as class or caste based instead of an individualist or communitarian dichotomy. Apart from the contradictions, the research is novel in its deeper examination of how varying interpretations support creative uses of the term for diverse purposes. For instance, Nietzsche's Chandala is a genius who is yet to be understood by old societal norms. Further, by asking simplistic questions about revolution and counter revolution, the privileges of Brahmins, the author unravels in many neglected aspects, such as the genius inventiveness and transgression of which Manusmriti itself is a part. To sum up, the book transcends time and space, addresses the concerns of varying interpretations, and explores the art of posing fundamental questions for critical inquiry. I would now invite Vedal to share his insights and comments.
Okay, thank you, Sakshi. And I think I would also thank Ankit sir that they've given such a brilliant presentation. I must
Please
really.
don't call me that. You can call me Ankit as well.
Okay, sure. So I remember we discussing Ambedkar and Nietzsche during our Ambedkar reading sessions that we held past few months. And coming from Nagpur, I think Ambedkar has been throughout my discussions all throughout my life. So I think uh, this is a brilliant piece that I could really get my hands on. There are a lot of interesting questions that I thought maybe I could discuss all of them with you, but I think that would have been overwhelming. And I have a set of 3 questions, and if you allow me, I can. Um, so I so there's an interesting discussion on the concept of priestly morality and slave morality, which are interesting ways to think about the working of untouchability and caste in India. So the idea of priestly morality as applied to Brahmanism is in as much as is slave morality is applied to it, even though we come to think of Brahmanism as a ruling ideology. So I was wondering, why is Brahmanism best understood as a slave morality rather than simply as, let's say, a form of reactive domination? So would you want me to spell out all my questions, or would we want to? Okay. So the second kind of question was regarding Ambedkar's conception of the idea of inferiority complex, which has also been significant in terms of describing how certain communities tend to organize themselves. So today also, as we see, and has been discussed in the later part of the book, today no prominent Hindu festival occurs without violent spectacles of organized abuse, as you quoting you. So I was also thinking in terms of how this has to do, if this has to do anything with the kind of inferiority complex that Ambedkar stressed upon, right? And thirdly, uh, there is an also interesting point when we account about Nietzsche, his ideas about punishment, revenge, resentment, right? So that stronger political communities become less dependent on cruel punishment has been well established in the initial discussions, as we see in the book. Uh, so I was in that line thinking that if you feel that the persistence of, as you quote, extrajudicial punishments in the contemporary India that we also discuss in the later part of book, as rather evidence of institutional insecurity in the Nietzschean sense, So I hope I'm clear with the questions. Okay, thank you.
Jigyasa, should I take a few minutes responding to
Yes, yes,
the
absolutely.
respondents? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, what we would do is, and we'll open the floor in terms of participants framing their questions and writing, typing them out on chat, and Ankit could have a few minutes to respond to these. Sakshi, did you have questions in mind?
Hi, yes.
So
Like,
no,
but
so we'll type them out so that by the time we're typing these questions out, Ankit has the time to respond.
perfect.
Let's do this. Let's do this. Okay.
Yeah, I sort of noted down certain comments/questions from Sakshi's overall response as well. So I should be able to respond to those too. So I'll start with Sakshi's comments only. So I think the first point that I found very interesting in their comment was the element of decontextualization, and this is something that I was trying to figure my way out during the very early phase of writing this work, which is basically when I was writing this in the form of my MPhil, which is also, what kind of a method I should employ in trying to understand these thinkers, because one of the prevailing consensus almost emerging from both the secondary literature around Nietzsche and Ambedkar, as well as a certain lay understanding that readers of both these philosophers have. I mean, uh, give and take the extent to which people closely read these two thinkers, was that Nietzsche gets the Manusmriti dead wrong in the sense of how little he understands the original intent with which the text was written, because of which he ends up praising the text as something that offers a useful counter to values that he does not like in Christianity, values of, say, pity or compassion and loving the neighbor and so on and so forth. um, and he also finds elements of, as Ambedkar quotes him, the noble classes guarding and guiding the masses, which Ambedkar found especially problematic because he basically says that there's no evidence in the Manusmriti itself of the noble classes, that is, the Savarna classes, the classes which have the ancestral right to perform the Upanayana ceremony, the ceremony which allows you to wear the sacred thread. There's no element as such of, what you might in an ahistoric sense call a certain sense of leading those who are not part of your own social group and so on and so forth. While on the other hand, if you see some secondary although there's not much, this is something that I point in the introduction to the book as well, that if you just compare the amount of secondary literature written on Nietzsche's reading of the Manusmriti as compared to Ambedkar's reading of the Manusmriti, you see a big mismatch insofar as Nietzsche's reading of the Manusmriti has received a lot of commentary in the secondary literature, while Ambedkar's reading of this text has not received a lot of attention. Although I note certain recent exceptions in the book as well. So the other side of that dynamic is where you encounter people saying that Ambedkar also gets Nietzsche wrong in a certain sense when he describes, for instance, Nietzsche's philosophy as being capable of producing Nazism on the one hand, which is drawing too quick a connection between his philosophy and his life. He died in the year 1900, and the rise of Nazism, which happens around 35 years later, as well as, for instance, using his terminology. So the English translated word of what Nietzsche calls Übermensch, Superman, as having anything to do with how the ruling classes in Hindu society operate. For instance, I mean, Nietzsche describes the Übermensch as beyond good and evil in his most famous text, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And many people, if they just read, superficially read, I guess, Ambedkar's description of Hinduism as being the gospel of the Superman, would like get extremely surprised as to how it would even make sense to describe um, Hinduism as being representative of Nietzsche's philosophy of the Übermensch. So I really like that point of decontextualization occurring in these thinkers' respective readings of this text itself. One of the things that I wanted to do there was not to simply report these so-called misreadings as something like providing, a sense of new information to to my readers. I also wanted to investigate, and this is something that I probably mean by using the words thinking with. I genuinely wanted to understand if at all these are misreadings and misunderstandings. Do they tell us something about unforeseen aspects of Nietzsche's and Ambedkar's thought systems at large? Can we use these misreadings to read these two thinkers differently? That is in some ways a provocation that I was dealing with and I was wanting to push forward in this book. And I try to do that, for instance, in the first chapter of this book, Who is Nietzsche's Chandala? By pointing out that even if we accept that Nietzsche got a lot of things from Manusmriti wrong, there are still certain central conceptual matters in Nietzsche's philosophy concerning concepts like revenge or equality or value, like concepts which are universally considered in the secondary literature on Nietzsche as being extremely important. Can his misreading of the Chandala in the Manusmriti tell us something different about these three concepts that everybody agrees are very important to Nietzsche's philosophy? That's something that I wanted to pursue in the book itself. Similarly, with Ambedkar, I thought instead of merely pointing out that Ambedkar may have misread or misunderstood Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, could Nietzsche's terminology of the Übermensch tell us something different about how Ambedkar reads Hinduism? And that is something that I sort of explain and describe in the fifth chapter, but really try to speculatively think with Ambedkar on this question in the sixth and concluding chapter of the book, where I try to argue, taking concepts from both thinkers, that Brahmanism is something that could be described as something that Nietzsche called a slave morality. And this is something that brings me to Vedal's questions to me as well. I would sort of club your first and second questions together because they sort of lead on from Sakshi's comments as well. Um, Nietzsche makes a crucial distinction between priestly moralities and slave morality. And Nietzsche has this very provocative statement in one of his books, which I find to be his most readable, which is On the Genealogy of Morals. I think it is in his first essay or maybe in the third essay, I'm not remembering correctly, but it's there somewhere in the book. I quote that sentence. He basically says that all religions are at their foundations systems of cruelties. So you see Nietzsche as being this paradigmatic atheistic thinker in modernity who gives you a sense of criticizing not this religion against that religion, not Hinduism versus Buddhism versus Christianity versus Islam and so on and so forth, but trying to give us something, what I call in the book, a generic understanding of religion as such, which he describes as a form of system of cruelty. All right. And one of the things that he highlights there as being representative of the cruel means with which all religions, are involved in, is the manner in which all religions give the highest pride of place to priests, right? So he basically says that there are, of course, religions without priestly classes, which do not probably give such a high pride of place to priestly classes. I guess like he does not mention them explicitly, but one can, for instance, think about, say, Adivasi religions in our country, which probably do not have such a clear distinction between who are the priests and who are the laymen, so called. But Nietzsche has this peculiar point that priestly moralities constitute a distinctly oppressive form of religion, right? And that's a generic understanding of religion that he says um, uh, cover a lot of big religions in the world: Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, so on and so forth. All right. Now, there he takes another step, right? in trying to sift through how to differentiate one priestly morality from another, right? And this is where he finds the Manusmriti to be really useful as a what is called in the secondary literature on Nietzsche as a counter morality to the morality represented by Christianity, right? So he simply says that Brahmin, like he used the word Brahminism. He never used the word Hinduism in his German books. He basically says that Brahminism and Christianity share the same feature insofar as both value priests very highly, but you take the sacred books of both religions and you find very different affective or emotional orientations emerging from them. So what he basically says is that if you find affects or emotions of love and pity and compassion being prized in um, Christianity, you find opposite values of pride and strength and ferocity being valued in the Manusmriti, which he thought was the sacred book of Hinduism. And of course, he probably wrongly thought that it was the sacred book of Hinduism. So I guess this I hope this sort of clarifies Nietzsche's analysis of religions at large as systems of cruelties involving priestly classes, and then taking a step forward, trying to think about how to still differentiate between one priestly form of morality as being somehow better than another priestly form of morality, right? um, and this takes me to how I try to join a certain analysis between Ambedkar and Nietzsche in the final chapter of the book, where the words used by Ambedkar, inferiority complex of the Brahmins during the Mauryan Empire, more or less, represent what Nietzsche characterized as slave morality. So one of the things that I guess one should take very seriously when it comes to um both Ambedkar's and Nietzsche's analysis of this text is that most of their comments about the Manusmriti, have a very precise empirical referent in most of the cases. So, for instance, in this peculiar case that you cite, where Ambedkar mentions the inferiority complex of a certain class, it's always useful to ask to which class described in the Manusmriti is he, attributing a certain inferiority complex to, right? And Ambedkar himself finds it very strange, and this is something that I discussed in the last chapter of the book as well, that the fundamental subject of the Manusmriti, like the figure on whom there are the most number of verses in the Manusmriti, the Brahmins, are described in one instance as the weak, and I cite this in the beginning of the sixth chapter, as being weak who can be grilled by the strong like fish on a spit. I don't recall the exact verse from the Manusmriti, but this is it's reproduced in the beginning of the sixth chapter. And I also find that characterization extremely thought provoking because Ambedkar is essentially highlighting the contradiction or the irony of a ruling class feeling itself to be extremely inferior, right? Or a ruling class feeling itself to be weak. That is what I sort of describe in the title of the sixth chapter as sovereignty become weak, right? Because you understand the meaning of sovereignty as implying ultimate authority or ultimate rule, unquestionable, absolute rule over a certain given territory, right? And it's astonishing that the founding text of a certain way of thinking, a certain Brahmanic way of thinking, characterizes the sovereign that it itself established as being weak or inferior in some ways, right? And Ambedkar does a big like historical analysis of how the Brahmins, and these are his words, were the depressed classes during the Mauryan Empire, because of which they enacted such cruel punishments against those who harmed them, the Kshatriyas and the Shudras of the previous age, and so on and so forth. But the conceptual and more philosophical question there is this: how can a ruling class feel itself to be so threatened that it imagines itself as being the victim, right? That it imagines itself as the oppressed, right? In a certain historical context. And I sort of mention in one of the footnotes from that chapter that that anomaly can be seen in EWS reservations today as well, where, for instance, um, the most privileged caste in some ways feels itself to be the victim because of reservation policies that have been followed for the last 75, 80 years or something like that. But that's like an aside which I aptly put in the footnotes of the book, I guess. Finally, I think where you end on the question of punishment, and again, that is something that I thought was a common ground between both Nietzsche and Ambedkar. So there's again this statement that I cite in the fifth chapter of the book, where Nietzsche, again in the genealogy of morals, says that as a community grows strong, similarly, the urge to punish others weakens in that community, right? And that sort of an analysis can be used to understand the really harsh punishments outlined in the Manusmriti. And again, it's a very interesting historical fact that the eighth chapter of the Manusmriti, which deals with danda, which is punishment, is the longest of the text. Like it has maybe 10 or 11 chapters, and the eighth chapter is the longest in the book. It has around 420 verses, right? So it's astonishing that a text which spends the most amount of time discussing punishments should also be taken to be a sign of strength, which Nietzsche apparently found in the Manusmriti, which Ambedkar categorically refutes, right? And that's something that, again, here could be pointed out through Nietzsche's own analysis of what punishment, what the urge to punish, what the will to punish really reflects of a community. He basically says that when a community feels itself to be undergoing a certain crisis, undergoing a certain lack of unity, lack of confidence, its urge to punish others increases simultaneously. And Nietzsche characterizes that as a matter of slave morality, because he basically says that masters do not treat others as subjects of punishment. They are indifferent to how the slaves live. They are not interested in punishing the slaves, but the slave is very interested in punishing the master, right? That is exactly what Nietzsche described as a slavish manner of valuation that could be seen in uh, so-called ruling ideologies that we are still trying to understand and grapple with. The ruling ideology in our case being, for Ambedkar's political thought, Brahminism. So I guess that there were a lot of other aspects, very thoughtful aspects from both Sakshi's and Vedal's comments there as well. I was able to cover only a few of them, but I'd be interested in hearing other people as well.
Sanjukta, we should open the floor for
I
questions.
think so. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, if you have a question, please unmute yourself. I'm sorry, there's some disturbance in the background. Sanjukta, can you take over?
Yeah. Okay, nobody has typed, but if anybody has a question, kindly unmute yourself and please ask question. Sakshi has I think, asked a question. If I might just read out. If graded inequality can extend even to animals, as the book suggests, has the basis of this inequality changed in contemporary society? Is discrimination today directed primarily at the animal itself? Or does it increasingly depend on the social identity, class, caste, or status of the animal's owner? Further, if I have understood it correctly, can you elaborate on the freedom of revenge in the case of Zarathustra, which appears to have its political antithesis in Chandala's Teachers of Revenge?
Okay, thank you, Sakshi, again for those great questions. So I basically have Patrick Olivell's translation of the Laws of Manu with me. And thank you for mentioning that aspect. So for other listeners, I discussed the aspect of how animals in our society are also, covered or encompassed within the logic of caste in the second chapter of the book, which is titled The Shortest Shadow, a Nietzschean Interpretation of Untouchability. So there I basically highlight a case of caste atrocity among many others, where animals are included as part of the reason as part of the reason because of which the atrocity happened. So it's not something that is exactly new, or it's something that is unprecedented. Because, for instance, if you read the Manusmriti itself, there are so many references to both plants and animals in this text. And one of the things that I find extremely interesting and somehow mind-boggling as well in this text is that, and I think it shows a certain um, vision of how expansive a thinker Manu was. And I mean, I say this as somebody who, of course, is equally critical of of Manu in this book as well. Is that he does not merely include human beings as being subject to hierarchy, right? He includes non-human beings, so plants and animals and so many other things, as being equally subject to the rules of purity and pollution. So, for instance, I don't know if you can see, but this appendix in the text called Flora and Fauna, which basically refers to all the plants and animals that have been referred by Manu in this text. And this is something that, again, Ambedkar and Nietzsche themselves do not really tackle. And this is something that I sort of bring into the discussion of how animals are also equally involved in the logic of the caste system. So the words that I discuss from the Manusmriti is where Manu mentions the pig and the dog as being polluting animals, along with what in various translations are described as eunuchs or transgender people, along with the Chandala, obviously, as being so polluting that they are unworthy to even witness a priest eating, like, or having his meal, right? So I take that verse as indicative of how Manu, for instance, on the one hand places the cow, at such a high pedestal of purity that they are supposed to be worshipped. And on the other hand, placing animals like dogs and pigs and equating them to the same polluting level as that of quote unquote eunuchs or transgender people and untouchables, right? I think that point in itself is um, something that even if the thinkers that we are studying did not pay much attention to, we should pay a lot of attention to that aspect of how Manu is so emphatic about hierarchizing not only human beings but also non-human beings in his larger vision of how the world should operate, right? And I guess that has a very direct influence, if you see, in the way that, for instance, cows are still worshipped in our society, to the exclusion of, say, buffaloes or other cattle, I suppose. But also the world of other animals whose deaths do not carry any, I mean, whose lives and deaths do not carry as much concern and care from the larger Hindu society, right? And I also point this out in the book that it is futile to draw causal explanations that because this is written in the Manusmriti, the Hindu society behaves this way. Um, I don't think it's a very useful explanation of social behavior. But at the same time, I do point it out that there is a certain commonality of worldview between both the Manusmriti, which was written around 2000 years ago, and the moral worldview of caste Hindus in our contemporary society, who do think that there are certain human beings who are at par with certain animals with the amount of purity that they embody. So, the cow, and again, this is in the Manusmriti, that the cow and the Brahmin's death or murder carry the same punishment from the king, which is the highest punishment possible, the death penalty, right? But for the murder of, say, a dog or a pig, it carries the same amount of punishment, which is some I think payment in kind, as the killing of a Shudra, for instance. So in the words of one Sanskrit scholar, animals and human beings both together operate as ontological groupings in the Manusmriti. And that is something that I find extremely fascinating. And it's something on which I guess a lot more research can be done as well. So on the second question, it's something that I deal with in the first chapter of the book. So probably this is something that you might realize in the process of reading, or maybe after reading the whole book, that this German philosopher Martin Heidegger is extremely important for not only the methodological aspects of the book, but also how I try to read Nietzsche. So Heidegger himself, I don't want to like talk too much about this one philosopher, but he himself has had a very checkered history in that he was himself involved in supporting the Nazi regime starting from 1933. But during that period, he also wrote, according to himself, such articles of Nietzsche which try to explicitly distance Nietzsche away from the Nazi or the fascist ideal that a lot of Nazi ideologues were projecting on Nietzsche, right? So, for instance, the phrase that you quote in your question, "freedom from revenge," that comes from Heidegger's article on Nietzsche, which is titled "Who is Nietzsche's Zarathustra?" coming from Nietzsche's most famous book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he basically says that Nietzsche's Zarathustra teaches humanity freedom from revenge, right? So he basically puts forth a certain provocation in that article, saying that how can somebody whose biggest mouthpiece, Zarathustra, taught humanity freedom from revenge, be taken to be a supporter of fascism or Nazism, which is all about exacting revenge on their enemies. Like the whole raison d'etre of fascism was that they want to exact revenge against the people who wronged them in the First World War, right? So this was apparently Heidegger's justification of trying to distance Nietzsche away from Nazi ideology by saying that the core of Nietzsche's teaching is that he teaches us freedom from revenge, right? And I find that statement not for, I mean, very important, not for Heidegger's own politics of distancing Nietzsche away from Nazism, but for, again, trying to contrast Heidegger's description of the figure of Zarathustra in Nietzsche against the descriptions of the Chandala that one finds in Nietzsche's published and unpublished works. So, in one instance in his unpublished works, Nietzsche describes the Chandala, which is a name and a term that he borrows and appropriates from the Manusmriti, as a teacher of revenge, right? And again, that's something that I find extremely valuable as a contrast, in the sense of I mean, the figure of the Chandala occupying an extremely important place in Nietzsche's imaginary, if he stands for teaching revenge, and whose opposition one finds in Nietzsche's core teaching, apparently, according to Heidegger, which is that Nietzsche's philosophy at large, in its essence, teaches humanity freedom from revenge, right? So it was a way, I guess, of trying to increase the stakes of Nietzsche's reading of the Manusmriti, saying that it does not only have value as Nietzsche encountering an Orientalist text, or texts coming from the non-Western part of the world. My main argument in that chapter is that the word Chandala has certain conceptual implications for understanding Nietzsche's main concepts like revenge, genius, value, etc. And this is the reason why we should pay attention to this word. Not because Nietzsche read a non-Western text that we are accustomed to read, but because it has certain conceptual implications for his political thought.
There are
So,
two questions, yeah.
yeah, so I'll let Sanjukta only do this because, yeah.
Yeah, so there's question from Rishabh. So we'll go one by one, I guess. Let's start with
Just one second. I'm so sorry. Ankit, do you have that kind of time? Because we have two more questions in the chat box. I wanted to touch with you in terms of, do we have that kind of time?
Yeah, of course. No
Okay,
problem with
okay.
time at all.
Okay. Yes, Sanjukta. I'm so sorry
yeah.
for interrupting. Yeah.
So we'll start with Rishabh's question. He's saying apologies for the little bit late. I'm curious whether it has been dealt with earlier or not. If you could reflect more about the title using the word provocations, methodologically, what distinguishes a provocation from a comparison or intellectual genealogy? You're muted.
You're muted, but you want to answer this one and then
Okay.
move on to the next.
Yeah,
I think
that's
that's
what
what
I
you're
was
asking.
that's what I was
Whichever way, whichever way.
I
It's a
think
delight to
it's
listen to
useful
you.
if I answer one question and then move on
Do
to the
that.
others.
Do that. Yeah.
So this is a very good question. Thank you so much, Rishabh, because this is something that I think in the process of writing in general, there are a lot of things that you keep implicit and do not make completely explicit and transparent like water. And the word provocations in the title is one such word where I try to keep matters a little implicit, I guess. And it's a way of, I guess, not completely putting all my cards on the table by expressing how much one philosopher determines my thinking to such a large extent. So the word provocation sort of comes from one of Heidegger's statements from one of his books. It's called What is Called Thinking. It's a very I mean, if you've read Heidegger, it's a quote that people sort of offhandedly quote at other people as being, something that was something like a truism coming from Heidegger's mouth following the Second World War. He basically said that this is in the context of the second world the events that followed the Second World War. Basically said in that book that the most thought provoking thing in our thought provoking age is that we are still not thinking. And later on in that text he basically says that his whole task of writing um, and thinking is basically to provoke uh, moments of thought in an essentially thoughtless age, right? And if we take a moment to read one of Heidegger's most influential students, Hannah Arendt. If you read her work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she basically highlights thoughtlessness, which is a term that she gets from Heidegger, as being the main motivators or carriers of what she calls a totalitarian ideology, right? So thoughtlessness is something that Heidegger and his student Arendt both classify as being one of the main emotions and one of the main characteristics of our age. And I probably do not think that we have outgrown that condition in some ways. And borrowing from Heidegger, that was sort of my way to hint, at his original usage, that the word provocation is usually directed against forces of thoughtlessness. And it's a bit, I mean, I was not trying to make such a grand claim, I guess, in my book about how our approaches towards Manu or Nietzsche or Ambedkar are mired in thoughtlessness somehow. I'm not making that case. But on the positive side of things, I am trying to make that claim that provocations always are provocations of thought, right? And it all comes from Heidegger, basically. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We have another question from Alok. He says, super presentation. Can the strength weakness anomaly be thought in terms of Brahmin strength rooted in a normative spiritual domain while they remain exposed in other domains of power, say armed owner or anything else? Is it about strength and weakness in different domains and instability of what domain becomes dominant? Or is it linked to the social order governed by Brahmins seen as fragile as a whole to break down and be supplanted by another order, asking from a place of ignorance and in spirit of curiosity? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Alok. I think that's an excellent question. And I deal with that problem extensively in the third chapter of the book, which is titled The Hands of Manu, or How to Author a Counter Revolution. There, Ambedkar is trying to. So basically, that chapter is a study of Ambedkar's historical writings, which he accomplished in the latter half of his life. So mostly the texts that he wrote during the 1940s. Who were the Shudras? the untouchables, who were they and how they became untouchables, and his unpublished texts, which were written more or less during the same time and in the early 50s. Revolution and counter-revolution in ancient India, philosophy of Hinduism, India and the prerequisites of Hinduism, India and the prerequisites of communism. These are more or less the 5 texts which I study in that chapter to answer one basic question, which is Ambedkar's question. So it's also not speculative as other chapters. It's a very descriptive and explanatory chapter in some ways, which is that Ambedkar thinks that if one solves the riddle of, and he uses the word riddle, he says if one solves the riddle of the composition of the Manusmriti, then one would understand what he calls the counter revolution that took place in ancient India and the effects of that counter revolution that we are still suffering to this day, right? So again, to repeat, Ambedkar thinks that some counter revolution happened in ancient India whose effects we are still facing in modern India, right? And the key to that riddle is to find out the origin of this text called the Manusmriti, right? And as I argue in that chapter, he builds a sort of an interpretive grid around the Manusmriti to tell the story of its own composition. So what he does there is he takes certain shastras, Dharma Shastra texts that preceded the Manusmriti, and he takes certain Dharma Shastra texts that succeeded the Manusmriti, and he tackles provisions about certain common themes across these shastras, right? And one of the themes that he finds really interesting or important, not interesting, crucial, foundational to how the origin of the Manusmriti is to be understood is what he calls the right to bear arms, right? So he basically says that there are certain texts written before the Manusmriti, Dharma Shastra texts, which prohibit, which do not allow Brahmins from acquiring arms and ammunitions, right? Which is what you signify by using the words having power in the spiritual domain, right? So Ambedkar basically recognized that there is a certain self privileging that the Brahmins do on the one hand by saying that we will not bear arms, which is the prerogative of the Kshatriyas. We will not practice uh, agriculture, and we will not practice commerce, which are the prerogative of the Vaishyas, and we will not serve, which are the prerogative of the Shudras, right? What we will do is we will participate in rituals. We will enact rituals, right? That is in our power. So Ambedkar analyzes a certain crisis in that fourfold division of occupation or tasks as being one of the reasons why the Manusmriti itself, becomes so important as a threshold that fundamentally divides all the texts that come before it and all the texts that come after it. And Ambedkar describes that in the form of Manusmriti being, in his words, a new thesis, a completely new foundation. This is something that I discuss in the third chapter. So what Ambedkar does there is he basically says, why does the Manusmriti give Brahmins the right to bear arms, right? He says that there is no other text in the Dharma Shastra tradition which acknowledges or which sanctifies the Chaturvarna order, at the same time violating one of the principal foundations of the Chaturvarna order, which is that um, occupational differentiation of tasks among the 4 classes. Um, where the Manusmriti basically says that yes, from now on, the Brahmins can both enact rituals as well as bear arms, right? Which ought to have been seen as a kind of a disadvantaging of the Kshatriyas, but the Kshatriyas do not take it that way. Was Ambedkar's conclusion from there, right? So what you asked there is basically hinting at Ambedkar's own discomfort at trying to find out the origins of why is it that the Brahmins thought having the right to bear arms was absolutely essential for themselves if they were to function as a ruling class hereafter. That was Ambedkar's main focus in trying to analyze the Manusmriti, and he basically puts it in these words that the Brahmins used what he calls the hands of Manu, which is basically to use the hands of an author, of a lawgiver, to make such a law that would make usurping the Kshatriya's right to bear arms as being lawful in nature, which, as Ambedkar himself points out, was completely prohibited in the earlier Dharma Shastra. So he even quotes this line, which I found to be a really startling line from, probably it's the Gautama Dharma Sutra, Dharma Sutra, um, or the Yajnavalkya Dharma Sutra, I'm forgetting. Basically, one of these two, where he says that the Brahmin should not inspect a weapon. Sorry, a Brahmin should not touch a weapon even for the purposes of inspection. Like, this was the stringency with which earlier Dharma Sutra texts dealt with the problem of any other class apart from Kshatriyas having the right to bear arms. But Manu is again a complete departure, according to Ambedkar's findings on this question, which again in Ambedkar's political conclusion suggests the urge, in Nietzsche's words perhaps, suggests a certain will to power on the part of the Brahmins, a certain will to what this anthropologist who is not taken very seriously nowadays, Louis Dumont, called the lack of temporal power uh, 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 of Brahmins, and basically a certain urge to acquire temporal power, right? Which is material power, kingly power, power in the real world. That is the hint, or that is the secret of Manu granting Brahmins the right to bear arms. So yeah, that's something that I deal with in the third chapter of the book. And thank you again for that question.
Thank you. I think, do we have any more questions?
There is a hand that is
I
raised.
think there's another. Yeah, I just saw this. G Tarun. Yes. If you
Can you hear
yeah.
me? Okay. Thank you very much, Ankit, for that illuminating lecture. I really look forward to reading the book. I liked how, alongside the close readings of Ambedkar and Nietzsche's readings of Manu, you prefaced it with that methodological clarification on comparative method. So my question is related to your to another earlier question you received on provocations. I'm curious if you'd suggest an affinity between Ambedkar and Nietzsche, specifically on genealogy as method. Well, obviously, each of Ricoeur's masters of suspicion had their own critical methods in their own ways. They all shaped what constitutes critical theory today. Similarly, would Ambedkar's use of history in philosophy of Hinduism, in Hinduism, count as genealogical in their unmasking of caste hierarchy? And might that challenge the idea that genealogy comes only from Nietzsche, Foucault, Bernard Williams, and others? And I'm curious to hear.
That's a very good question, and this is something that I do not deal with in this book as such. But I'm so sorry to self-advertise my own work. But I happen to write an article on what I tried to call Ambedkar's historicizing gesture, as part of his more historical books that I just mentioned that he wrote in the 1940s, titled "Clearing of the Ground: Ambedkar's Method of Reading." Um, so there I tried to, so this was not a comparative study, but there I basically tried to highlight Ambedkar's own struggles with the historical method as he tried to find out, in his words, the origins of untouchability. And one of the things that, now that you say it, and I'm sort of thinking on the spot here, um, that connects Nietzsche and Ambedkar both on the question of their method into reading history, is that both of them are deeply suspicious of um, written records of historical and archival evidence, which is to say that both of them acknowledge the importance, but at the same time, the limitations of what historical evidence or archival evidence or written works from the past can tell you about the origins of a particular phenomenon or an event. So, to give you an example, um, Nietzsche describes his method as being genealogical in his book Genealogy of Morals, because he felt that the contemporary writers, so for instance, there were writers like Johann Bronkhorst and Goethe during his time, who were taking works of the history of the origin of religions very seriously, right? And Nietzsche found all of those works deeply dissatisfactory for explaining the origin of emotions like, for instance, pity in Christianity. He says, what is that? What are those historical records that would tell you the origin of the emotion of pity in Christianity, right? And he says that if you want to pursue that question, you can rely on historical records, but at the same time, they might not be very useful in yielding a satisfactory answer, right? So it is not something that is um, completely opposed to the historical method, genealogy. It's something that acts as a supplement or something that acts as an acknowledgement of the limitations of the historical method. This is at least how I try to read genealogy in Nietzsche, which is to try to give an account of the origins of something, an event, an idea, an emotion, um, whose presence is not to be found in historical sources, right? And of course, that is something that requires a lot of speculation. That's something that requires some bit of imagination on the part of the thinker, and all of that is something that Nietzsche affirms as part of his genealogical method. And he says that this is why this should be considered something distinct from proper history writing, right? Similarly, with Ambedkar, and as I try to point out in that article as well, uh, what he does there is that he basically says that, and these are his words, the literature of Brahminism does not give a sufficient or an adequate answer to the origin of untouchability. So what is a historian supposed to do in that sort of a situation? So in a very crucial paragraph from, I guess it's his the untouchables, who were they and how they became untouchables, probably it's from the introduction or from the preface, where he basically compares himself or compares anybody who is interested in the question of the origin of untouchability, not to a historian proper, but to an archaeologist or a paleontologist, who studies scattered bones and tries to reconstitute a certain animal which has gone extinct, right? He says that the kind of textual material that one has to understand the origin of untouchability is in the form of these scattered bones, which does not tell you a lot, right? So in that paragraph, he does say that the historian of such a phenomenon like untouchability, has to employ imagination, has to employ some speculation in trying to come up with an account of an event or a phenomenon which has eluded our so-called historians for so long, right? And that is something that I see as a kind of a commonality between both these thinkers on a methodological level. But that's something that I sort of did not pursue in the book itself. And I'm really thankful to you for pointing that out.
Yeah, thank you very much for clarifying that. I mean, again, illuminating responses.
Do we have more questions? Okay, Swahasini has just typed one. Sanjukta, let me give you a break. Let me read this out.
Okay.
Okay, Ankit, I'm still checking with you. We do have that kind of time. Or maybe this will be a last question. This will be a last question, requesting others to seek Ankit out and maybe bombard him with the emails, which I think he will have the chance to respond to at his own will whenever he gets time. But this will be for our last question. So Hasini says, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation and huge congratulations on the book. Apologies in advance for a very generic question, and I'm asking this much as a young researcher, given how complex the themes and the thinkers you've worked on are. I'd love to hear a bit about your process and the method of reading texts. How did you navigate the structural or interpretive challenges of this project? What did you find to be the biggest hurdle or challenge while putting this thesis together? And do you have any advice for students of political science trying to navigate comparative philosophy? Yes, it seems like a catch-all question, Ankit.
That is an excellent question, and I'm so happy that this was raised here, because um, I'm still a PhD student, and in some ways, as I was writing my MPhil, of course, one's dissertations have a very limited audience. Like, more or less, one thinks that one's advisor, and I guess in some cases even they don't read. I guess that's how sad the situation has become in some universities. But yeah, more or less one writes for one's advisor and one's research committee. But in the process of revising and extending that dissertation into a book, one of the main and probably the biggest challenge that I had was to uh, uh, rethink how I want to address my readers, who are not going to be only my advisor or my research or people in my research committee. And I thought one of the maybe simpler ways to deal with that question is to channel my own studently spirit in that endeavor, and think about trying to understand these, again, as you say, complex themes and thinkers from my own position. So many a times I was trying to write as a mode of self clarification, trying to gain a clarity about these concepts myself, which I hoped would similarly provide a certain clarificatory, you know would provide a certain clarificatory tone to the people who might read this text. And there I was explicitly thinking of not only myself as a student, but also students in general who might be working on their own, dissertations uh, in various universities in India and elsewhere, and basically trying to think of them as being my main audience, and trying to think of how can I make these very complex thinkers and themes palatable, but at the same time rigorous, so that it matches the rigor that's supposed to be there in a dissertation, or any other work that comes out from a dissertation. So that was, I guess, one of my main challenges in terms of extending the dissertation into a book. But you mentioned other aspects as well, and one of the things that I was completely stumped by at the beginning of my writing of the dissertation was the amount of texts that I was dealing with. I mean, it was genuinely very hard for me to keep track of all the books that I was trying to deal with. So I was dealing with the original text of the Manusmriti on the one hand, and three translations of the Manusmriti. Um, Georg Bühler's translation, Wendy Doniger and Brian K. Smith's 1991 translation, and then the most latest translation available, which is Patrick Olivell's, which is the one I showed. This is the one that I mostly relied on, but then, as you might notice, I give out versions of Bueller and Wendy Doniger's translations in the footnotes as well, because Ambedkar referred to Bueller's translation. And keeping track of all that material was extremely difficult. Along with, Nietzsche and Ambedkar both have written probably more than 20 or so books, including both published and unpublished material, not even including the amount of secondary literature that's been written on these figures. And I mean, that amount is still increasing to this day. So genuinely, I mean, the amount of literature that I was just dealing with was mind-boggling, and it was in some ways helpful for us that the MPhil was written during the COVID pandemic, which gave us one more year. So I finished my MPhil in 3 years instead of the allotted 2 years. That gave me slightly more time, and ever since then I have been revising this book, and the challenge of dealing with so much material did not, of course, go away. But I was taking extensive notes, and I had all the notes of all my reading with me, which was making it easier for me, to sift through all the material and have a certain focused attention to the main concepts that I want to focus on for all these three major um, philosophical traditions that I sort of deal with in this book. So I mean, if I have to sound a bit more gyani on this subject, I guess I would still say that more reading is always more useful. Like, one should still not get bogged down by the amount of literature on a given topic if one is beginning to choose one's research topic. I guess the fact that there's more literature on a topic just says that you're onto something good. You're onto something that is still making a lot of people take interest in a particular topic. So that's something that is also, I guess, that was a major challenge. And finally, I guess, this is something that I absolutely did not anticipate, but there were also multiple languages that I was dealing with in this research project: Sanskrit, German for Nietzsche, and of course English and Marathi for Ambedkar. And one of the things that in hindsight, that I thought maybe I could have done better was to have a more holistic picture of the original writings of as in the original version of Nietzsche's writings in a lot of instances, given alongside the quotations in English broadly, and also a lot of Marathi writings of Ambedkar, most of which I have not read. But no, actually, that's not accurate. I have read quite a lot of it, but I did not find a lot of it being of direct use to my study in this particular book. But it's something that I'm keeping uh, as a subject of analysis in my future work. So I guess whatever I'm writing ahead of this on Ambedkar will have a lot of stuff from his Marathi writings as well. But and again, with the Sanskrit sources in the book as well, this is something that I thought maybe would not look very good, in terms of just the aesthetics of the page, I suppose, if one has like four languages written on the same page. That was a major consideration for why I did not, include Sanskrit versions and German versions and Marathi stuff from all these three thinkers in the same book. I thought maybe it would be more useful to include different languages if I'm dealing with these thinkers in isolation. So having two languages is sort of easier to handle than handling like four languages in a single text. But again, if I can be slightly verbose on this question, having a subject that straddles multiple languages is always a good sign that you're onto something good, and that you're maybe dealing with something that would interest a wide readership, a readership that transcends only one language. So that was also a challenge which I thought was only which I thought was not very well handled in the book itself. But I guess that's something that can be resolved in my future work on these two thinkers too.
Okay, before Sanjukta closes, I'm going to take the opportunity. I had many questions, but I'm getting the opportunity to meet you sooner, and I'll probably be your discussant on that day, so I'll reserve the space for that. But to your method, I wanted to add for anybody who's watching, uh, per square unit, this book already has too many ideas. It's a very dense book. And when Ankit says that that was his challenge, I think he can be called quite successful in bringing together what you'd call myriad things and making like uh, a purposeful story for anybody who may not have engaged with these subjects before. For them to delve into this book, you would come out of it having understood a lot, as opposed to not understanding anything at all, given it's Nietzsche and there are four languages. In fact, I was not aware, despite knowing you personally, that you had functional knowledge of German, because you say that in the introduction that you got intrigued with this idea in your undergrad itself. So it's not something that's only happening in MPhil. Which, to add again to your method a bit, is also to say that from 21 to 26, and then I'm assuming that your undergrad must have been another, so books and ideas, and what we're seeing here, with him coming back and telling us all the things that he remembers in minute detail, are not things that appear in 2 years' time. I mean, I'm sure he's dealing with and sitting with these notes and questions for years now. So many congratulations, Ankit, and thank you so much for taking out the time and answering all our questions. And I wish that the book flies off to places that it needs to. It's a brilliant, brilliant work, and I don't say that lightly, and I don't say that because we've known each other. And on that note, I will now pass this on to Sanjukta.
I think what I had to say, half of it you have already said, Jigyasa. I think thank you for accepting to speak to us. It is one of the first time that you are introducing your book. It says a lot. But yes, and we are so happy that you chose us. Thank you for agreeing to be the first speaker for our Ambedkar series. Yes, and we have started the series with you. We are very happy and such a great talk. Thank you so much. I would also like to thank Sakshi and Vedal for being the discussant of the thing, and everyone who has been a part of this Baitak and have been there since every Baitak also. Thank you so much. Hope to meet you all in the next Baitak soon. Thank you.
I'm sorry because I forgot. So I'm so sorry. I'm so chatty, but I'll apologize. So in December we started an Ambedkar reading group, and from January onwards we've been meeting every 2 weeks, and we're sitting together and trying to read Ambedkar in original, but also on primary, secondary, whatever literature comes our way. So this is also a call from this platform that if you're interested in Ambedkar or if you want to talk about Ambedkar, and I think we'll bring this book up as one of our book in the one of the reading sessions in future. Now that we have a snippet into it, so this is an invitation. If you're interested, please, you know the social media's handles that we have. You know where to reach us. You have our editor's email ID. Please write to us, and so that you can come on that group and we could read together and learn with each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Thank you so much. Bye bye. Thanks for having me.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.